The morning Nina Calloway lost her apartment, the sky was the color of old pewter and the temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the building where she and her daughter had lived for 4 years, watching the last of their boxes come through the front door, carried by her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who had offered without being asked. A moving truck would have cost money Nina didn't have. So instead it was cardboard boxes, a borrowed cart with a wobbly wheel, and the quiet humiliation of packing up a life in plain view of passing strangers who glanced and looked away. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Lily sat on top of a box labeled kitchen misc and held her stuffed rabbit by one ear, watching her mother the way children watch adults when they sense something important is happening but can't name it yet. She was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her absent father's straight brown hair, and she hadn't cried once all morning, which somehow made everything harder. "Are we going to Grandma's?" Lily asked. "For now, baby. Just for a little while." "How little?" Nina didn't answer that one. She didn't have an answer. She loaded another box into the back of her 12-year-old Civic, wedging it between the laundry basket and the lamp without a shade, and told herself to keep moving. Stillness was the enemy on days like this. Stillness gave the weight of things room to settle fully on your chest. She had lost her job at the insurance company 3 months earlier when the regional office closed without warning. She had worked there for 6 years, answered phones and processed claims, and memorized the names of every regular caller. And then one Tuesday morning there was a sign on the door and a number to call for severance information. The severance lasted 2 months. The job search lasted longer. She'd had 3 interviews and no offers, and the landlord had not been sympathetic about the rent. Her mother's house in Millfield was 40 minutes east, a 2-bedroom ranch with a yard full of dead grass and a kitchen that smelled permanently of cigarettes and coffee. Her mother, Diane, had agreed to take them in with the particular kind of reluctant generosity that made a person feel worse for accepting it. There would be comments, Nina knew. There would be sighs and small comparisons, and the specific silence that Diane used when she wanted someone to understand how much she was sacrificing. Nina had grown up inside that silence. She knew its every texture. She was 34 years old and moving back into the town she'd left at 18, and the thought of it made her feel like she was climbing backward, like the years of effort had been erased in a single season. One bad turn, one company folding, 1 month where the math refused to work, and here she was, back at the start. Or somewhere worse than the start, because at least at the start there had been hope attached to the uncertainty. They loaded the last box at 10:15 in the morning. Mrs. Patel hugged Lily and pressed a bag of apples into Nina's hands and told her she was the finest tenant the building had ever had, which was kind but probably not true. Nina thanked her. She buckled Lily into the back seat, started the car on the second try, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. She found out about the inheritance 6 days later. The letter came to her mother's address, forwarded 3 times based on the chain of crossed-out lines on the envelope, each one a different place Nina had lived in the past decade. The return address was a law office in a town called Greaves, in a part of the state Nina had never visited. The name on the letter was hers. The tone was formal and careful, the kind of careful that lawyers used when they weren't sure how the news would land. She read it at the kitchen table while Lily was at school and her mother was watching a game show in the other room. She read it once and set it down. Then she picked it up and read it again. The letter informed her that she had been named as the sole heir to a property known as the Hartwell Estate, located outside of Greaves in Whitmore County. The property had belonged to a man named Edward Hartwell, her father's maternal great-uncle, a man Nina had never met and whose name she had only heard once, years ago, in passing. Edward Hartwell had died at the age of 89, with no surviving spouse, no children, and a small mountain of legal complications surrounding his estate. His will had taken 4 years to clear probate due to disputes among distant relatives who had since died or withdrawn their claims. Nina was what remained, the last name standing. The estate, the letter said, included the main house, several outbuildings, and approximately 40 acres of land in Whitmore County. The property had been unoccupied since 1987. At the bottom of the letter was a line Nina read 3 times before it settled. Please be advised that the property is currently assessed at significantly below market value due to its condition, and that the estate carries no liquid assets. The inheritance consists of the land and structures only. No money, just a house that had been empty for 37 years. She put the letter face down on the table and went to make coffee. Her sister Carol called that evening, as she always did, and Nina told her about it. That was a mistake, but she had no way of knowing that yet. Carol was 41, owned a house in the suburbs outside Columbus, and had the particular confidence of a person who had made sensible decisions at every fork and found. The results satisfying. She loved Nina. She also found Nina's life choices quietly baffling, and she never entirely managed to keep that from her voice. 40 acres and a falling-down house, Carol said, after a pause long enough to tell Nina exactly what was coming next. Nina, honey, you can't live in that. I haven't decided anything yet. You have nowhere to live. You have a daughter. Mom's house is not a long-term solution. We both know that. What you need is a job, not a project. I said I haven't decided anything. Did you ask the lawyer what the property taxes are? Because if it's been sitting for 37 years, there may be back taxes. That would become your responsibility the second you accept. Nina hadn't asked that yet. I'm just saying, Carol continued, that sometimes an inheritance is actually a burden dressed up in legal language. People think they're getting something for nothing, and then they're stuck with a sinkhole they can't sell and can't afford to fix. I read about a family who inherited a property in rural Tennessee, and it cost them $60,000 just to get the title clear. You read a lot of articles, Carol. I'm trying to help you. I know. There was a pause. Then Carol said, more gently, let me know what you decide. But please be practical. Nina thanked her and hung up and sat in the dark of the small room her mother had given them, where Lily was asleep in the folding cot by the window, and the walls were thin enough to hear the television from the next room, and the ceiling was low and close in the way that made Nina feel like the whole house was slowly pressing down. She picked up the letter again, read it again, folded it neatly along its original creases, and put it in the front pocket of her bag. She called the lawyer the next morning. His name was Robert Altman, and he had a deliberate, unhurried way of speaking that Nina found reassuring, as if there was enough time in the world to explain anything properly. He told her that the property taxes had been paid through a small trust that Edward Hartwell had established specifically for that purpose, and that the trust had just enough money left to cover one additional year. After that, the responsibility passed to whoever held the deed. He told her that the house had been built in 1891 and was a substantial structure, 12 bedrooms, 4 floors including a basement level, a carriage house, a greenhouse that had mostly collapsed, and a stone cottage at the far end of the property that had served as a groundskeeper's residence. He told her that the last person to occupy the main house had been Edward Hartwell himself, in the winter of 1986, and that the circumstances of his departure were not fully clear in the records he had available. He told her that she was under no obligation to accept the inheritance, that she could decline, and the property would revert to the county. But he also told her that if she wanted to see it before making a decision, he would arrange access. What was he like? Nina asked. Edward Hartwell. Do you know anything about him? A pause. The sound of papers being shifted. The file I have is quite old. What I can tell you is that he was a private man. Very private. He had very little contact with the outside world in his later years. There are some notes in the file from the original probate attorney suggesting that the estate may contain personal effects of some historical significance, but there was never a formal inventory done. The house has been sealed since he left it. Sealed how? Locked. Boarded in places. I believe the utilities were disconnected sometime in the early 90s. But structurally, based on the most recent survey, the main house is considered sound. Nina thought of her daughter asleep in the folding cot, of the walls pressing inward, of her mother's silence filling every room. I'd like to see it, she said. She told her mother over dinner that night. Diane set down her fork with a deliberate kind of care and looked at Nina the way she had always looked at Nina when she felt a lecture was required but was deciding how blunt to make it. You're going to take it, Diane said. It wasn't a question. I want to look at it first. It's been empty since Reagan. It's probably full of mold and raccoons and God knows what else. She picked her fork back up. I'm just saying, Nina, this sounds like trouble. Your father's family was always trouble, even the ones I never met. You never met any of them. Exactly. There was a reason for that. Lily had been quiet through the whole dinner, eating her spaghetti in careful twirls. Now she looked up and asked, with the absolute seriousness of an 8-year-old processing information, "Is it a mansion, Mama?" "I don't know yet, baby." "Is our name on it? On the deed?" "It might be soon." Lily considered this. She twirled another bite of spaghetti. "I think we should go look," she said, with the settled certainty of someone who had made up her mind some time ago and was only now announcing it. Her mother reached over and touched her daughter's hair, and for a moment something eased in her chest. "Yeah," she said. "I think so too." The drive to Greaves took 3 hours on back roads that narrowed as they went, the landscape flattening and then slowly rolling into low hills covered in bare November trees. Lily fell asleep an hour in, her head against the window, her rabbit tucked under her arm. Nina drove with the heater on high and the radio low and let herself think. She had not told her mother how bad things actually were. She had given the broad version, the one that sounded like a rough patch rather than a slow collapse. The truth was more specific and harder to say. The credit cards were maxed. The unemployment payments would run out in 6 weeks. She had applied for 43 jobs in the past 3 months and received 11 rejections and 32 silences, which in some ways felt worse than the rejections. She had $340 in her checking account and a Civic that needed new brake pads. She didn't think the Hartwell Estate was going to save her. She wasn't naive enough for that. A 12-bedroom house abandoned for 37 years with no utilities and unknown structural problems was not a solution. But it was something. Land she could stand on. A name on a deed. A place that was hers in a season when nothing felt like hers. Sometimes that was enough to keep moving forward. Sometimes the only thing you needed was a reason not to stop. She reached Greaves at 1:30. It was a small town with a main street of mostly closed shops and a gas station that still had a hand-painted sign. Robert Altman's office was on the 2nd floor of a building above a dry goods store. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, with a neat gray mustache and the careful handshake of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned to make contact gently. He gave her the paperwork, walked her through the inheritance documents, explained the deed transfer, and answered her questions with the same unhurried patience he'd shown on the phone. When she asked again about the personal effects mentioned in the file, he pulled out a manila folder so old the edges had gone soft and leafed through it slowly. "This is from the original probate filing in 2019, he said. "The estate was first filed when Edward Hartwell died, but the challenges dragged things out. In the original survey notes, there's a mention of what the surveyor called, quote, an extensive collection of items in the lower levels, though he noted that access was limited by the state of the interior." "Lower levels? Meaning the basement?" "I believe so, yes. But I have to be clear with you, Miss Calloway. I don't know what's in that house. No one does. There was never a full interior assessment. The building was surveyed structurally from the outside and the ground floor only. The surveyor noted that several interior staircases were obstructed, and he didn't proceed further." "What kind of man was Edward Hartwell? You mentioned he was private." Altman leaned back. "From what the file suggests, he was a collector. He traveled extensively in his youth, spent decades in Europe and parts of South America. He came back to Greaves sometime in the late 60s and lived at the estate full-time after that. Almost never left the property in his later years. People in town remember him as eccentric. Some of the older residents remember seeing lights in the upper windows at odd hours. He had deliveries brought to the gate rather than the house." He closed the folder. "Other than that, I can tell you very little. He lived the kind of life that doesn't leave much trace in public records." Nina signed the papers that afternoon. Altman gave her the keys, 3 of them on an old iron ring, heavy and dark with age, and a county map with the property marked in red pen. He told her the nearest hardware store was 12 miles back the way she'd come, and that the electricity could be restored to the main line with a call to the county utility company, though the interior wiring would need inspection before anything was actually turned on. She thanked him and shook his hand and walked back down the stairs to the street where Lily was waiting beside the car eating crackers from a bag, looking at the mostly closed storefronts with the curious expression she wore when absorbing a new place. "Did we get it?" Lily asked. "We got it." Lily processed this for a moment. "Can we go see it now?" "That's exactly where we're going." The road to the Hartwell Estate was unpaved for the last 2 miles, the packed dirt surface rutted and ridged by years of freeze and thaw with no one to grade it smooth. Tree branches had grown over the road in sections, forming low arches that scraped the roof of the Civic as they passed beneath them. The afternoon light came through the bare trees in long, broken lines, striping the road in pale and shadow. Lily had her face pressed to the window. They came around a long curve, and then the gates were there, wrought iron between two stone posts, standing slightly open, as though someone had left in a hurry decades ago and never come back to close them. The iron was red-brown with rust along the hinges, and one of the gate posts had a crack running from top to bottom, filled with moss. A chain hung loose from the latch, attached to nothing. Beyond the gates, the drive continued through overgrown grounds, the grass long dead and pressed flat by seasons of neglect, the shrubs shapeless and sprawling. The trees that had once been planted in formal rows now grown wild and unpruned. Dead vines covered the stone walls that ran on either side of the drive. A stone urn had toppled from its plinth and lay cracked on the ground, half buried in weeds. Nina drove through the gates slowly. Then the house came into view. She had expected something grim. A ruin, maybe. Boards over windows, a sagging roofline, the general collapse that 37 years of emptiness could achieve. But what she saw stopped her breath in a way she hadn't prepared for. The house was vast. For stories of gray stone rising against the sky, the kind of stone that had weight to it, that had been quarried and cut and placed by hands that knew the work would outlast them. The roofline was complicated, with towers at each corner and dormers along the upper floor, and a wide central section with a peaked gable above the main entrance. The windows were large and many, running in rows across each floor, most of them intact, though coated in decades of grime. A broad stone staircase led up to the front door, flanked by stone balustrades, some of which had crumbled at the edges, but most of which still stood. The grounds around the house were deep in dead vegetation, the formal garden completely reclaimed by weeds and wild growth, but she could see the bones of what it had been. The low stone edging of beds, the ghost of a circular path, the outline of something that might have been a fountain, now just a stone basin full of leaves, and standing water turned dark with algae. It was not a ruin. It was something stranger and more complicated than that. It was a place that had been grand and had been abandoned at the height of its grandeur, so that the decay felt like a kind of pause rather than an ending, like a held breath waiting to be released. "Mama," Lily said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I know. Is that ours?" Nina looked at the house for a long moment. The 4 stories. The towers. The stone that had been standing for 130 years and clearly intended to stand for 130 more. "Yeah, baby. It's ours." They sat in the car for a full minute before either of them moved. The front door opened on the second key, the lock stiff but not frozen, requiring both hands and a hip against the frame to push the door wide. The smell that came out was not rot, which was what Nina had braced for, but something older and stranger, the smell of closed rooms and still air and time sealed inside a space. Dust. Old wood. Something faintly sweet that she couldn't name. The entry hall was 2 stories high. A curved staircase rose along the right wall, the banister intact, the treads covered in a thick layer of dust so undisturbed it had a texture to it, like fabric. The walls were dark paneling, would gone nearly black with age, hung with framed paintings that Nina couldn't make out in the dimness. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystal clouded with grime, a few pendants missing. The floor was marble, black and white in a geometric pattern, largely buried under dust and debris carried in by years of wind through whatever gaps existed in the structure. Nina stood in the doorway and looked at it, at the scale of it, at the sheer ambitious accumulation of space and material that someone had put here more than a century ago, and that had waited, sealed and still, for 37 years. She stepped inside. Her footstep on the marble was very loud in the silence. Lily came in behind her and immediately reached for her hand. They stood together in the entry hall, 2 people in a space built for many more, and listened to the silence of the house, which was not quite total. There were small sounds in it. The creak of the structure adjusting to the cold. Something far away that might have been wind through a gap in an upper window. The particular quality of quiet that belonged only to very old and very large spaces. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. "It's like a sleeping castle," Lily said. Nina squeezed her hand. Yeah, something like that. They spent the rest of the afternoon doing a careful circuit of the ground floor, moving through rooms that opened one into the next, each one dim and still and layered in dust. A formal dining room with a long table still set with dishes, the china dusty but unbroken, as though the last meal had ended and no one had cleared the table before leaving. A drawing room with covered furniture, the sheets pale with dust, the fireplace intact and large enough to stand in. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves still full of books, the spines unreadable in the poor light, some volumes fallen sideways or forward. A study where papers still covered the desk and a brass pen holder stood undisturbed, as though someone had stepped out to get coffee and simply never returned. That was what struck her most, the sense that the house had not been stripped or sold or emptied before it was abandoned. Edward Hartwell had left it as it was, left the dishes on the table, the papers on the desk, the books on the shelves. Left it all in place, like a world preserved under glass, like he had walked out one day and deliberately left everything behind, or like he had left in a hurry, like he hadn't had a choice. The kitchen was at the back of the house, large enough to serve the household the building had been designed for, with a central wooden work table, a cast iron range that had to be original to the house, and copper pots still hanging from the ceiling rack, green with oxidation. A door in the kitchen opened onto a short passage that led to a back entrance, and another door was set into the far wall, closed, with a padlock through the latch. Nina tried all 3 keys on the iron ring. None of them fit. She stood at the locked door for a moment, her hand on the padlock, feeling the weight of it, newer than everything else in the room. The cast iron on the range was original, the copper pots were old, the wood of the work table had the worn finish of decades of use. But the padlock was different. The metal was cleaner, the mechanism less corroded. Someone had put this here after the house was already abandoned. That thought stayed with her. They did not try to go upstairs that day. The light was failing and neither of them had thought to bring flashlights. And the staircase, though intact, was deep in dust, and Nina didn't want to take chances without knowing the condition of the upper floors. She told Lily they would come back tomorrow, properly prepared, and Lily accepted this with the practical patience that had always been one of her best qualities. They drove back to Greaves and found the town's one motel, a 12-room place with a parking lot full of dead leaves and a vending machine that took Lily's $1 and then didn't dispense the chips but kept the $1. Nina reported this to the front desk, and the man behind it, without looking up from his phone, simply handed her a bag of chips from under the counter as though this happened regularly. She and Lily ate the chips and crackers and peanut butter from the jar Nina had packed, sitting on the motel bed, watching a nature documentary about migratory birds, and Nina made a list on the back of the driver's seat. Utilities, structural inspection, cleaning supplies, flashlights, good ones, work gloves, face masks, a generator, or at least an extension cord run from the car. Food for more than a day if they were going to do this properly. She looked at her checking account on her phone. $340. Then she looked at the property deed on the bed beside her, the ink fresh, her name printed clear on the line that mattered. She thought about Carol's voice on the phone, patient and certain in the way Carol always was. She thought about her mother setting down her fork. She thought about the 43 job applications and the 11 rejections and the 32 silences. She thought about the locked door in the kitchen and the padlock that was newer than everything else in the room. She turned the television off and lay in the dark next to Lily, who was already asleep, and stared at the ceiling of the motel room and let herself think without interruption about what she'd seen in the house that afternoon. The dining room table still set for a meal that was never finished. The papers still on the desk, as if waiting for the hand that would never return to them. The library full of books no one had touched in 37 years. And a man described as a collector, a traveler, someone who had spent decades in Europe, in South America, who had come home with things and lived privately with them for years, and then left it all behind. What had he collected? She reached for the motel notepad and wrote down what the lawyer had said. An extensive collection of items in the lower levels. Access limited by the state of the interior. She underlined lower levels. She was still looking at those 2 words when she fell asleep. The second day started with hardware. She drove to the store 12 miles back and spent $160, which left her sick with the spend, but there was no way around it. 2 flashlights and extra batteries. A pack of heavy work gloves. disposable masks, a box of contractor-grade trash bags, a small crowbar for stuck doors, a box of candles because the flashlights would drain eventually, and she'd grown up in houses where you always had backup light. She also, on impulse she couldn't entirely explain, bought a small camera from the display rack near the register. Not expensive, a basic digital point-and-shoot on clearance. She wasn't sure what she expected to find that would be worth photographing, but something in her wanted to have a record. Something in her had been paying attention to the locked door and the lower levels and the quiet weight of everything she didn't yet know. Lily wore her puffy coat and her rubber boots and held her rabbit by the ear as they pulled through the iron gates the second morning. She had decided that the rabbit should come. She had also decided, apparently overnight, that this was a place worth getting excited about, because she spent the whole drive in asking questions Nina couldn't answer. Who had lived there? Why had they left all the dishes? What were those stone shapes in the garden? Was there a cellar? We'll find out, Nina said every time. We'll find out today. The house looked different in the morning light. Still vast, still buried under its layers of neglect, but lighter somehow, the stone less oppressive in the pale winter sun. Nina could see more of its detail from the drive. The carved stonework above the main entrance, figures and shapes worked into the arch that she hadn't noticed in the gray afternoon light. The ironwork on the windows, decorative and precise. The remains of a kitchen garden to the west side of the house, the beds outlined in stone, something that might have been a rose arbor collapsed against the wall. Someone had loved this place. That was what the details said. Someone had built it with care and kept it with care for a long time. And then something had happened, and then it had been sealed and left. They went in through the front door again, Nina leading with the flashlight, Lily directly behind her. The entry hall looked the same as yesterday, the dust unmarked except for their own footprints from the afternoon before. She went straight to the staircase and tested the first tread carefully, pressing her weight on it slowly. It held without a sound. She went up 3 more steps. Solid. The banister moved slightly when she gripped it, but didn't shift. She came back down. We can go up, she told Lily. Carefully. Stay close. The second floor was a wide corridor running the full length of the house, bedroom doors on both sides, all of them closed. Nina opened each one and swept the flashlight around quickly, making initial notes in her mind. Furniture under sheets. Windows intact. Fireplaces in each room. The grates rusted, but the masonry sound. No obvious water damage. The floors dusty but unwarped. At the end of the corridor, a door was different from the others. Heavier. Fitted with a lock rather than a simple latch. Nina tried the keys. The second one turned. The room beyond was not a bedroom. It was a study, but not the one she'd seen on the ground floor. This was smaller and more crowded. The walls lined not with books but with shelves, and on those shelves were objects. Objects of every kind. Arranged with care, but so numerous that they overlapped and layered and stacked, filling every available space. Ceramic pieces. Figurines carved from what looked like ivory and stone. Wooden boxes, some inlaid, some plain. Glass cases containing coins and small metal objects. Rolled tubes that might be maps or drawings. Photographs in frames, some standing, some stacked flat. Nina stepped into the room and moved the flashlight slowly around the shelves. Lily came to stand beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. What is all of this? Lily said. I don't know yet. She picked up one of the ceramic pieces carefully, turning it over. On the base was a small maker's mark, hand-painted. She couldn't read the signature, but the style of it, the weight, the glaze, told her nothing concrete because she knew nothing about ceramics. She set it back carefully. She opened one of the wooden boxes. Inside, nested in aged velvet, was a pocket watch, gold, engraved on the back. She tilted it toward the flashlight. The engraving was a crest of some kind, an eagle and a shield, with letters below it she couldn't read. She closed the box. She looked at the shelves more carefully. There was no chaos to this collection. Each item had been placed. The wooden boxes were ordered by size. The ceramic pieces were arranged by height. The framed photographs were sorted by some system she couldn't immediately decode but could feel in the arrangement, a deliberateness that spoke of someone who had known exactly what they had and where each thing belonged. Edward Hartwell had known the value of what he collected. He had cared for it. He had organized it. She took photographs with the small camera. Every shelf, every case, every group of items. She worked methodically, moving through the room, documenting what she could see without touching too much. There were glass cases she couldn't open without a key she didn't have. There were tubes on the upper shelves she couldn't reach without a step stool. There were items at the back of shelves too dim for the flashlight to reach clearly. But even what she could see was enough to understand that this room alone contained a collection that had taken years to build. Decades, maybe. And this was one room on one floor of a 12-room house with lower levels she hadn't reached yet. She took the last photographs and stood in the doorway looking back at the shelves. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, and she would lose the day soon if she didn't start down, but she stayed a moment longer, trying to absorb the specific quality of what she was looking at. A man had traveled the world and brought pieces of it home, had lived with those pieces for years, had left them all behind one day and never returned. What had happened to him? Why had he abandoned this? She locked the room again with the key and put the iron ring in her coat pocket and led Lily back down the corridor toward the stairs. Are those things worth anything? Lily asked. I don't know. Maybe. Like a lot. I honestly don't know, baby. Lily thought about this as they went down the stairs. At the bottom, she looked up at Nina with that particular expression she wore when she was about to say something she had reasoned out carefully and was presenting as fact. I think they might be, she said, because the man who lived here went to a lot of trouble to keep them. Nina looked at her daughter. 8 years old and standing in the entry hall of a 12-bedroom stone house she technically owned, wearing a puffy coat and rubber boots, and holding a stuffed rabbit, speaking with the calm certainty of someone who had thought it through and arrived at the obvious conclusion. Yeah, Nina said. I think they might be too. She had asked the motel man that morning about Hartwell. He was in his 60s, a lean man with a red face and the permanently deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades in a slow town and had stopped pretending things were urgent. He'd been at the desk both mornings, and both mornings he had watched Nina and Lily with the quiet attention of someone who processed strangers as a professional habit. When she asked about the Hartwell Estate, he set his coffee down. You the one who inherited it, he said. Not a question. News traveled fast in small towns. It always did. Yes. He looked at her with something between curiosity and caution. Your family. The Calloways. My father's side. Distantly. He nodded slowly. I remember when old Hartwell left. I was maybe 20, 21. Wintertime. People in town said he drove past the gas station on the way out of the county and never came back. Nobody really knew him. He kept to himself. But his family had been here a long time. Before the town was the town, practically. Do you know why he left? The man picked his coffee up again. There were stories. There always are. Some people said he had trouble. Financial trouble. Others said he had made some enemies he didn't want to deal with. Old stories. The kind that get told so many times nobody knows anymore what's true and what got added along the way. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. You plan on living out there? Thinking about it. He nodded again, with the same slow deliberateness. Big place for 2 people. We'll manage. He seemed to think about whether to say the next thing. Then he said it. My uncle did some work out there once. Long time ago, before Hartwell left. Repair work on the outbuildings. Said the man had the most things he'd ever seen inside one house. Had to go around back to the kitchen because Hartwell didn't like people coming through the front. Said there were rooms full of things. Stacked. And packed. Old things, he said. The kind of old things that came from a long way away. He set the cup down. That's all I know. Old stories. Nina thanked him and loaded Lily and the hardware store bags into the car and thought about what he'd said the whole drive to the estate. Rooms full of things. The kind that came from a long way away. Back in the kitchen, she stood again in front of the locked door with the padlock that didn't match the age of anything around it. She studied it more carefully this time with the flashlight on it directly. The padlock was a good one, a commercial-grade lock, the kind hardware stores sold for storage units. The staple was set into a hasp that had been screwed into the door itself. The screws were not original to the door. Someone had drilled them in later. She looked at the door itself. The wood was old, matching the rest of the kitchen, but the hinges had been replaced. She could see where the old hinge holes had been filled and new ones drilled. Whoever had fitted this door had done it carefully. It didn't look like a renovation. It looked like a reinforcement. Someone had made this door harder to get through at some point after the house was built. She used the crowbar on the hasp rather than the lock. 3 minutes of work and the screws pulled free and the hasp swung loose and the padlock came with it, still locked. still connected to nothing. She set it aside and pulled the door open. Beyond it, stone steps led down into darkness. She shone the flashlight down. The stairs were narrow, carved from the same stone as the foundation, worn smooth in the center from generations of use. The walls on either side were stone, unfinished, the mortar between the blocks dark with age. The bottom of the staircase was not visible from the doorway, the angle too steep, the darkness complete beyond the range of the flashlight. The smell that came up from below was different from the rest of the house. Cooler, drier. The smell of stone and deep still air, and something else underneath it, faint and impossible to name, that made the hair on Nina's arms move. She stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. Lily had come to stand beside her. They both looked down into the dark. "Is that where the lower levels are?" Lily asked. "I think so. Are we going down?" Nina thought about the 43 job applications, about $340 in a bank account, about the folding cot at her mother's house and the thin walls and the silence that pressed. She thought about the ceramic pieces on the shelves upstairs, arranged by height, cared for, documented in the mind of a man who had spent his entire adult life knowing exactly what he had. She thought about what could be stored in a room below a house like this, sealed with a newer lock on an older door, with reinforced hinges and reinforced silence. "Yes," she said, "but not today. We're losing light, and we need better equipment, and I want to know what we're doing before we go down there." She stepped back from the door and pulled it mostly shut, leaving the broken hasp to the side. "Tomorrow. We come back tomorrow with better flashlights and a plan." Lily nodded. She looked at the door for another moment, then looked at her mother. "Mama," she said, "I think this house has secrets." Nina looked at the stone steps disappearing into the dark, at the reinforced door, at the padlock sitting on the kitchen floor, still locked, still protecting whatever it had been put there to protect. "Yeah, baby," she said. "I think you're right." She took Lily's hand and led her back through the kitchen toward the front of the house, through the entry hall with its dusty marble and its clouded chandelier, out through the heavy front door and down the stone stairs into the cold afternoon air. She stood on the drive and looked back at the house. For stories of gray stone against the winter sky, the windows dark and opaque, the towers at each corner reaching up past the bare trees. A house built to last centuries, built with care, filled with things a careful man had gathered across a lifetime of traveling the world. A house that had been sealed and left, that carried inside it a collection no one had touched in 37 years, that had stairs leading down to a level she had not yet seen, behind a door someone had reinforced and padlocked long after the house was built. Her name was on the deed. Her name was the last one on the list that had taken 4 years of legal dispute to resolve. The last relative standing. The heir of a man she had never met who had lived a private and careful and deliberate life in a house full of things gathered from every corner of the world, and then walked out one day and left it all exactly as it was. She took a breath of cold air and looked at the house for another long moment. Then she walked back to the car, started it on the first try for once, and began to plan for tomorrow. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the motel bed, and the house occupied her thoughts with the particular persistence of something that had taken root. The locked room on the second floor and its shelves of carefully arranged objects. The study on the ground floor with papers still on the desk. The dining room with the table still set. The kitchen with the door reinforced against entry. A man described as a collector who had spent decades in Europe and South America, who had come back and lived privately with his collection until one day in 1987 he left and never returned. He hadn't sold it. He hadn't arranged for anyone to care for it. He hadn't even cleared the table. Why? She got up at 2:30 and sat at the small motel desk with the notepad and a pen and wrote down what she knew, the way she used to organize information at the insurance company when a claim didn't make sense and she needed to see the pieces laid out. Arrived back in Greaves late 1960s. Lived at the estate full-time. Rarely left the property. Had deliveries brought to the gate. Lights seen in upper windows at odd hours. Described by neighbors as eccentric. Left in winter of 1986. Circumstances unclear. Never returned. Died without returning. She underlined never returned. Then she wrote, what did he know that made him leave? Then, below that, what is in the lower levels? She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote one more line. Why would someone reinforce that door from the outside? She put the pen down, turned off the lamp, lay back down next to Lily in the dark. The answer she kept coming back to was this. You reinforced a door from the outside when you wanted to make sure no one else got in after you left. Not to lock something out, to lock something in. Edward Hartwell had sealed that door himself. He had reinforced it and padlocked it and walked away and never come back. Whatever was in the lower levels of that house, he had decided it needed to stay there. And then he had died, and the house had sat sealed for 37 years, and the legal disputes and the distant relatives and the probate proceedings had all come and gone. And at the end of all of it, there was Nina Calloway, 34 years old, $340 in the bank, her name on a deed, standing at the top of those stone steps looking down into the dark. She had called Carol that evening, from the motel parking lot, so Lily wouldn't hear. She had kept it brief because she had already made the decision and she wasn't calling to be talked out of it. You signed it, Carol said. The same flat delivery as before. The sound of someone whose prediction has come true. I did. Okay. A long exhale. Okay, Nina. Tell me you at least have somewhere to stay while you figure out what the place needs. There's a motel in Greaves. For how long? How much is that going to cost? Not much. It's fine. And after the motel? You can't live in a house that hasn't had utilities since the 90s. I'm going to get utilities restored. With what? Nina, I'm trying to be honest with you because someone needs to be. You have no income, you have a child, and you have just accepted responsibility for a property that will cost money to maintain before it ever earns you anything. Unless you can sell it quickly, and an abandoned estate in rural Whitmore County is not exactly a fast-moving market. You are going to be worse off than you were before. Nina said nothing. I love you, Carol said. But this isn't a fairy tale. Old houses don't turn into palaces. They turn into money pits. There are things inside it, Carol. What kind of things? I don't know yet. But the man who owned it was a collector. He spent his whole life gathering things. He never emptied the house when he left. A pause. So there are things inside a house that's been abandoned for 37 years. That's what you're counting on. I'm not counting on anything. I'm being curious. That's different. Carol made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Okay, call me when you know more. And please, for the love of everything, don't let Lily get hurt in a building that hasn't been inspected. She had hung up feeling exactly the same as when she picked up the phone, which she supposed was a victory of sorts. She had not been talked out of it. She had not been made to doubt herself into paralysis. She still had the deed and the keys and the iron ring in her coat pocket. She had called her mother next and gotten a shorter version of the same conversation, Diane's contribution being mostly silences punctuated by the occasional mem that conveyed deep and practiced skepticism without requiring the effort of complete sentences. Her mother had grown up poor and had spent her whole adult life treating caution as a virtue, which it was until it became a reflex, and by now it was entirely reflex. Diane didn't distinguish between reckless decisions and unfamiliar ones. Both made her go quiet and tight around the eyes. The last call had been to Mrs. Patel, who had been the most useful. Mrs. Patel had actually asked questions, the practical kind, about the structure and the utilities and the legal standing, and when Nina had answered them she had said, in the matter-of-fact way she said everything, well, you could do worse than land. Land stays. That was all. Land stays. It was, Nina thought, the only genuinely helpful thing anyone had said to her all week. She thought about what the lawyer had said. An extensive collection of items in the lower levels. Extensive. That was the word. Not a few things. Not personal effects. Extensive. A man who had traveled Europe and South America for decades. Who had known enough about what he collected to organize it by category and care for it over a lifetime. Who had lived with it privately and protected it carefully and then sealed the most important part of it away before he left. Nina stared at the motel ceiling. Tomorrow she would go down those stairs. She would go carefully, with proper light and sensible preparation, because she had a daughter and responsibility and she was not a reckless person. But she would go, because whatever Edward Hartwell had sealed in those lower levels, it had not been put there to be forgotten. It had been put there to wait. And whether he had meant for it to wait for her specifically, or for anyone, or simply for time to render it safe, she couldn't know. But here she was, his heir, the last name standing, the one the deed had been waiting for. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and somewhere in the direction of the estate, The iron gates she'd left standing open creaked softly in the dark, and the stone house sat silent on its 40 acres, holding its breath, waiting for morning the way it had been waiting for everything, patient and certain and full of things not yet found. She bought a second flashlight at a gas station on the way out to the estate the next morning, a heavy one with a beam wide enough to illuminate a room rather than just a point, the kind utility workers used. Lily held the smaller one and wore her rubber boots again and had decided, apparently between sleeping and waking, that the rabbit should stay in the car today because what they were doing was serious work. That was what she said. Serious work. Like she was 40 and had done this before. Nina drove through the iron gates in the cold pale light of 8 in the morning and parked close to the front steps and sat for a moment before getting out. The house stood exactly as she'd left it. The gray stone, the dark windows, the complicated roofline against the winter sky. She had thought about it so much in the night that seeing it again felt strange, like meeting someone face to face after a long correspondence. The house she had carried in her head was made of fragments and flashlight impressions. The real thing was always more than that. They went in through the front door and straight back through the entry hall and the dining room and the kitchen, moving with the purpose of people who knew where they were going. Nina set the heavy flashlight on the kitchen work table and put on her work gloves. She looked at the door she'd opened the day before, the broken hasp hanging loose at the side, the padlock sitting on the floor where she'd left it. The smell of the lower levels came up through the gap, cool and dry and layered with something she still couldn't name. She picked up the heavy flashlight, looked at Lily. You stay close. One hand on the wall at all times going down. If I tell you to stop, you stop. Lily nodded. She had her small flashlight on already, the beam pointing at the floor. Nina put her foot on the first stone step. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The stairs were steeper than they looked from above. 14 steps, which she counted on the way down, each one cut from the same gray stone as the walls, each one worn in a specific pattern that told her these stairs had been used often, for years, before the house was sealed. At the bottom, the floor leveled out and Nina swept the flashlight beam in a slow arc and stopped breathing for a moment. The basement was not one room. It was a corridor, wide, stone-floored, with a low-arched ceiling and doors on both sides, spaced evenly down the length of it. The corridor extended beyond what the flashlight could fully illuminate, disappearing into the dark. The walls were bare stone, the same color as the foundation above, with iron torch brackets spaced along them, empty, and a series of wall-mounted electric fixtures that would have run off the house's wiring, also empty of bulbs. The floor was thick with dust but clear of debris, as if the corridor had been swept clean before the house was sealed and nothing had entered since. Lily came down the last 2 steps and stood beside Nina, and they both looked at the corridor without speaking. How far does it go? Lily whispered. Nina shone the beam to its limit. At the end of what she could see there was another door, larger than the ones along the sides, and beside it, set into the wall, what looked like a circuit panel. Far enough, Nina said. They moved down the corridor, trying the first door on the left. It opened without resistance, the hinges smooth, the latch turning easily. Nina put the flashlight through first, and then followed it in. The room was small, maybe 15 feet by 12, and lined entirely with wooden racks, floor to ceiling, the kind of rack that wine cellars used, each slot sized for a bottle, but not holding bottles. Holding tubes. Cardboard and metal tubes of varying diameters, each one capped at both ends, stacked horizontally in the slots with the careful regularity of a library. There were dozens of them, more than 100. Each tube had a small paper tag attached with string, handwritten numbers in a neat script. Nina took a tube from the nearest slot. Cardboard, thick-walled, the caps fitted tightly. She worked one cap loose and tilted the tube, and a rolled cylinder of canvas slid out, wrapped once in a layer of thin cotton muslin that had yellowed with age. She held the flashlight under her arm and carefully unrolled the first inch of canvas, just enough to see what was there. Oil paint. Very old oil paint. The surface cracked in the fine pattern called craquelure that Nina had read about once in a magazine article about museum conservation, the distinctive web of age lines that appeared in paintings centuries old. She could see part of a background, deep brown-black, the kind of ground color that painters used 300 years ago. She rolled it back and rewrapped it, and slid it carefully into the tube and replaced the cap. She stood very still in the small room with 100 tubes in the racks around her. Old paintings. Not prints. Not reproductions. Old oil paintings on canvas, rolled and stored in tubes in a sealed basement room, each one tagged with what appeared to be an inventory number in a collector's careful hand. She photographed the room. Every rack. Every tag she could read. She took a tube from each section and photographed the tags up close. She did not open any more of them. She had seen enough for now. The second room on the left was locked. She tried the keys. None of them fit. She moved on. The third room held crates. Large wooden crates, stacked 3 and 4 high, each one stenciled with symbols and numbers she couldn't interpret. The wood was old, but the stenciling was intact. Some of the crates were very large, the size that might hold a piece of furniture, or a sculpture, or something larger than a person. Some were smaller, the size of a suitcase. All of them were sealed with screws, not nails, and sealed well, the joint between lid and crate tight enough that no light showed through. She photographed them all. The first door on the right held something she was not prepared for. It was not crates or tubes. It was open shelving, the shelves running along 3 walls, and on the shelves were pieces of gold. Not coins, not jewelry, though there was some of that. Objects. Solid objects of worked gold, some of them small enough to hold in a palm, some of them larger, bowls and vessels and figures and architectural fragments. All of a style she had seen once in a documentary about South American pre-Columbian civilization, the kind of objects that existed in museum collections and had not been in private hands for generations. The surfaces were unmarked by tarnish or corrosion because gold did not corrode. They sat in the dark as clean and complete as the day they were made, whenever that was, whether it was 500 years ago or 1,000. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. She had never thought of herself as someone who would be unable to speak. She was a practical person. She had answered phones for 6 years at an insurance company and learned to stay level-voiced through almost anything. But she stood in the doorway of that room and could not say a single word for a full minute while her flashlight moved across the shelves. Lily came to stand behind her and looked over her arm. "Are those real?" Lily asked. "I don't know yet." She heard her own voice. Flat. Careful. The voice she used when she needed to stay level. "I think so. I don't know." She photographed the room. Every shelf, every object, every angle she could capture in the flashlight beam. She didn't touch anything. She moved around the perimeter with the deliberate care of someone who understood, at some instinctive level, that she was in a room where a wrong decision could have consequences she couldn't yet calculate. At the end of the corridor was the large door. When she reached it, she found that the circuit panel beside it was simply a light switch array and not a breaker box as she'd thought from a distance. She flipped the first switch. Nothing. Obviously, the power had been cut decades ago. But there was something taped to the inside of the panel door, a card in a plastic sleeve, yellowed and faded. She peeled it free carefully and brought it close to the flashlight. An inventory list. Typewritten. Columns of numbers and letters and descriptions. The paper was old, but the plastic sleeve had protected it. She read down the first column. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and tried the large door. It opened on the third key. Beyond it was the largest of all the rooms. Nina stepped in and swept the flashlight in a slow full circle, and the scale of it settled over her with the weight of something physical. It was a gallery, not a room with shelves. A gallery, designed for it. The ceiling higher than the corridor outside. The walls flat and plastered rather than rough stone, and hung from top to bottom with paintings in frames. Large paintings, some of them as wide as a doorway and as tall as a standing person. The frames were heavy gilt, museum weight, the kind of frames that cost more than most household objects. The paintings themselves were dark with age and the low visibility of the basement, but the forms within them were clear enough in the flashlight beam. Figures in rich clothing. Landscapes with thick, clouded skies. A woman at a window with light falling across her face in a way that made something move in Nina's chest because she recognized that quality of light, had seen it before in a reproduction in a textbook she'd read in a class she'd taken at community college before she dropped out to work full-time, a class on European history that had required 1 chapter on Renaissance art. She moved the flashlight slowly across the nearest wall. The paintings were not prints. They were originals. Oil on canvas, oil on panel. The surfaces had the texture of age, the impasto and the crack patterns, the depth that came from layers of glaze built up over years. In one corner of the nearest large canvas, she could see a signature, the kind of signature that would have meant nothing to her a week ago and meant everything to her now. She took out the folded inventory card and read it again with the flashlight. The first column heading said, Description. The second, Origin. The third, Acquisition date. The fourth, Estimated value, $1,981. She ran her finger down the fourth column. The numbers were in 5 figures. 6 figures. One entry read 4,500,000. Another, 8,200,000. Another, 12 million. Those were 1,981 numbers. She folded the card and put it back in her pocket. She stood in the gallery and looked at the paintings and tried to do the arithmetic in her head and couldn't hold the numbers steady enough to get there. Mama, Lily said, from the doorway behind her. Are you okay? Yeah. A breath. Yeah, I'm okay. You look like you did when we got the eviction notice. Nina turned around. Her daughter stood in the doorway of the gallery with her small flashlight pointing at the floor and her expression careful and assessing in the way it got when she was trying to read a situation. I'm okay, Nina said again. I just need a minute. She sat down on the floor of the gallery, cross-legged, in the dark and the dust, and pressed her hands flat on the cold stone and breathed in and out slowly while her brain tried to organize itself around what she was looking at. Edward Hartwell had not been a man with some old furniture and a few family heirlooms. Edward Hartwell had been a man with a private museum sealed beneath his house for 37 years, with an inventory card on the door that listed paintings and artifacts valued in the millions in 1981, and those numbers had only gone in one direction since 1981. She had no idea what it all added up to. She did not have the knowledge to make that calculation. She was not an art historian or an appraiser or anyone who would know the current market value of old master paintings or pre-Columbian gold objects or rolled canvases in 100 tubes in a sealed room. But she knew enough to know that the number was very large. She got back up and photographed the gallery. Every painting, every frame, every signature she could find. She filled the camera's memory card and switched it out for the spare she'd bought at the hardware store and filled that one too. She worked methodically around the gallery, spending 30 seconds on each painting, trying to capture enough detail that an expert could look at the photographs and tell her something. When she was done, she walked back down the corridor and up the stairs and into the kitchen and sat at the work table and looked at her hands for a while. Lily sat across from her and put the rabbit on the table between them. They had retrieved it from the car before going in. It's a lot of stuff, Lily said. Yeah. Is it the good kind of a lot? Nina looked at her daughter. I don't know yet, baby. I really don't know yet. She drove back to the motel and spent the rest of the afternoon on her phone, which had data she couldn't really afford but was now not a choice. She looked up pre-Columbian gold artifacts. She looked up old master paintings sold at auction. She looked up the painting style she'd seen in the gallery, the thick skies and the specific quality of light, the heavy gilt frames. She looked up provenance records and collector histories and the kinds of numbers that appeared at the end of auction results for 17th century Dutch and Flemish work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By evening, she had a picture. Still incomplete. Still full of things she didn't know. But a picture. Old master paintings from the Dutch Golden Age and the Italian Renaissance period, depending on what exactly was in those frames, sold at major auction houses for anywhere between $500,000 and $100 million apiece. Pre-Columbian gold objects, depending on their origin and age and cultural significance, sold in the low millions at specialist auction, and the major museums paid more for them and lobbied for their return through legal channels. The rolled canvases in the tubes, if they were what she thought they were, could be anything from minor works by known artists to major pieces that had been missing from the record for decades. She did not know what she had, but she knew it wasn't nothing. She called Carol at 9 in the evening, after Lily was asleep. She sat in the car in the motel parking lot with the engine off and the cold coming through the windows while she talked. I went into the basement today, she said. A pause. And, Carol, there are paintings down there. Old paintings in frames. A whole gallery of them. And a room full of rolled canvases and storage tubes, probably more paintings. And a room full of gold objects, pre-Columbian stuff, the kind you see in museums. She heard herself saying it, and it sounded like what it was, something that couldn't be true. There's an inventory card from 1981, and the numbers on it are in the millions. Silence on the other end of the line. Carol, I heard you. More silence. Then, Nina, I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it without getting defensive. Okay. How do you know they're not reproductions? I don't. Not for certain. But they don't look like reproductions. The paint surfaces, the cracks, the way the frames are made. I took photographs. Nina, you're not an art expert. I know I'm not. You could be looking at very good fakes. Or very ordinary originals worth almost nothing. Or originals that are too old to sell legally. Or that have provenance issues. Or that belong to someone else. There are 100 ways this could be not what you're hoping it is. I know all of that, Carol. That's why I need to get someone out there who actually knows. A long exhale. Okay. Who? I don't know yet. An appraiser. An auction house. Someone from a university art history department maybe. I need someone who can look at what I've got and tell me what I'm actually dealing with. And in the meantime, you're staying in a motel outside of town in Whitmore County. Yes. With Lily. Yes. On $300. $260 now. Another silence. The particular silence of Carol constructing a response that contained both her concern and her genuine disbelief that this was happening. Nina could feel it through the phone. All the careful restraint of a person watching a train do something trains shouldn't do. Okay, Carol said finally. Find your expert. But Nina, don't tell anyone else what's down there until you know what it is. If there's any chance this is real, you don't want people to know about it before you understand what you have and what your legal position is. I hadn't planned to. I know. I'm saying it anyway. A brief pause. Call me when you know more. And be careful. Old basements are structurally unpredictable. She admitted practically. But after Nina hung up, sitting in the cold parking lot, she thought about what Carol had said in a different way. Be careful. Not just about the structure. About all of it. She thought about the reinforced door. The padlock. A man who had driven past the gas station one winter day in 1987 and never come back. Had he been careful? Had he known he needed to be? She went back inside and looked at Lily sleeping in the folding cot, and then sat at the desk with her phone and searched for the name Edward Hartwell. There was almost nothing. A brief mention in a 1974 county newspaper article about a local historical society meeting. His name on the list of attendees. A reference in a 1969 New York gallery show catalog, under acknowledgments, thanking private collectors who had loaned works for the exhibition. The catalog did not specify which works. His name appeared again in the records of a maritime shipping company in 1961 and 1963 and 1967 as a client for overseas freight services. She searched the 1969 gallery catalog reference more carefully. The exhibition had been called Rediscovered Works, Dutch and Flemish Masters from Private Collections. She could not find a full digital copy of the catalog, but she found a brief review in a newspaper archive, which described the show as containing several works previously unknown to scholarship, loaned by a group of collectors who had acquired them through private European sales during the post-war period. She sat back. Post-war. Private European sales. In the years immediately after the Second World War, enormous quantities of European art had moved through private sale channels, displaced by the chaos of the conflict and its aftermath, changing hands quickly and cheaply as families tried to convert assets to cash or simply move things before borders closed again. Some of those sales had been legitimate. Some had not. Much of what moved through the post-war art market had murky histories, provenance records that were incomplete or deliberately obscured. She was not suggesting anything specific. She didn't know enough to suggest anything specific. But the picture that was assembling itself in her mind was of a man who had known how to find things, who had spent the post-war decades buying in Europe when prices were low and records were incomplete, and had brought what he found home to Whitmore County and kept it very private for the rest of his life. She made a note of the gallery catalog reference. She made a note of the shipping company name. She wrote down the 1974 Historical Society mention and the 1981 inventory card dates. Then she looked for art appraisers. She needed someone who could look at old master paintings and pre-Columbian gold and tell her with authority what she was dealing with. Not a regional auction house that sold farm equipment and estate jewelry. Someone with the knowledge to assess paintings that might be centuries old and the experience to know what questions to ask about provenance. She found a name after an hour of searching. Dr. Patricia Wan, Associate Professor of Art History at a university 3 hours north, with a published specialty in Dutch Golden Age painting and a secondary interest in early 20th century collector histories. She had written papers about the post-war European art market. She had consulted for auction houses and legal teams in provenance dispute cases. Nina sent her an email at 11:45 at night, which she recognized was not ideal, but she could not wait until morning. She kept it short. She was the new owner of an estate containing what appeared to be a substantial private art collection. She needed an initial assessment of what she had. She could offer transportation costs and a day rate if that was relevant, and she would be happy to send photographs first if that would help the expert decide whether the inquiry was worth her time. She attached 20 of the best photographs from the basement gallery. She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling. She lay awake for a long time, the inventory card in her coat pocket on the chair beside the bed, its numbers moving through her head in no particular order, adding and not adding up, the 1981 values that meant nothing until they were translated through 43 years of art market inflation into what they might mean now. She fell asleep eventually with the arithmetic unresolved and woke to the sound of her phone at 6:15 in the morning. It was an email reply. Patricia Wan. Short, professional, and ending with a question that told Nina everything she needed to know about whether the photographs had been worth sending. Dr. Wan had written, "I'd like to see these in person. When are you available?" They arranged it for 2 days later. Dr. Wan drove down herself rather than waiting for Nina to arrange transport, which Nina had not expected and which told her something. An academic with a busy schedule did not rearrange 2 days to drive to Whitmore County for photographs that didn't interest her. In the meantime, Nina cleaned. She had no other way to be useful and she needed to be doing something. So she drove to the hardware store again and came back with a mop and cleaning supplies and a bucket, and she started on the kitchen floor while Lily worked on the entry hall with a smaller broom, sweeping dust into piles and then looking at what the dust had been hiding, which was the marble pattern beneath, black and white, and still intact. They worked through 2 full days. They didn't go back into the basement. Nina had decided without quite deciding that she wanted a professional present when she looked at it again, wanted someone who could tell her what she was seeing in real time rather than her standing alone in the dark trying to remember details. To report later. She opened all the ground floor windows to air the rooms out. She moved the furniture in the drawing room, pulling the sheets off the covered pieces, and found the furniture intact beneath, heavy Victorian pieces, solid and undamaged. She opened the library and went through it with the flashlight, reading the spines where she could, and found what she'd expected, a collection organized by a deliberate mind, the books arranged by subject, European history, art, archaeology, South American civilizations, numismatics, which she looked up and found meant the study of coins and currency. She found something she hadn't expected in the top drawer of the desk in the study on the ground floor. A leather journal, slim, the kind meant for personal notes rather than the long narrative entries she might have imagined. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was small and very neat, the pen pressure even. The entries were dated, the most recent one from December of 1986. 2 months before Edward Hartwell had driven past the gas station for the last time. She read the December entry slowly. He had written about the collection, not in vague terms, but in specific ones, the way a man who had spent his life organizing things wrote about them. He referred to items by the numbers she'd seen on the inventory card. He referred to paintings by informal shorthand names she didn't understand yet. He wrote about a shipment that had arrived in October that he described as the most significant acquisition of the past decade, and said that it was now in the lower gallery, and that he was satisfied with its condition. Then, at the bottom of the entry, in slightly different ink, as though written later the same day, a single line. "There are people asking questions I can't answer safely. I don't know yet what I will need to do." Nina held the journal in her lap and looked at that line for a long time. Then she put the journal carefully in her bag and went to check on Lily, who had moved from the entry hall to the drawing room and was working on one of the windows with the glass cleaner, her small hands making careful circles on the pane. The light was already different in the rooms they'd cleaned. The windows cleared, The dust moved, the air no longer quite so still. It wasn't a transformation. It was the first suggestion of one, a room that was beginning to remember what it had been built to be. Lily looked over her shoulder at Nina. "This window looks onto the garden," she said. "There's a path out there. I can see where it goes." Nina looked through the cleaned glass at the dead garden beyond, the stone edging of the beds, the ghost of the circular path, the collapsed arbor against the far wall. She could see it too now. The garden had been designed by someone with care and money and a long view. A garden built to be looked at from exactly this window, the path drawing the eye in a line toward the stone basin at its center. She thought about Edward Hartwell standing here, 37 years ago, looking at this same garden, writing in his journal that there were people asking questions he couldn't answer safely. She thought about what it would mean to have built what she'd seen in that basement. To have spent 40 years of your life finding things, and keeping them and cataloging them, and caring for them. To have made something in the dark below your house that no one else knew existed. And then to have to leave it. To have to drive past the gas station and keep going and never come back and let it all sit sealed in the dark for decades, wondering if anyone would ever find it. He had not tried to sell it. He had not contacted museums or auction houses or tried to liquidate any of it before he left. He had sealed it and gone. Left the table set and the papers on the desk and the library intact. He had left it for someone. He might not have known who. He might simply have known that the deed would pass eventually to whoever was left of the family, and that whoever that was would walk into the kitchen and find the locked door and wonder about it, and that the wondering would be enough. Or maybe he had known more specifically. Maybe he had known that the legal path would lead here eventually, to a name, to someone. Nina's name was on the deed now. She was 34 years old, and she was standing in a house her great-uncle had built a life inside, looking through a window he had looked through. And in 2 days a woman who knew the difference between an old master painting and a reproduction was going to walk down those basement stairs with her. And when that happened, Nina understood, everything would change. Not might change, would change. Because whatever those paintings were, whatever the gold objects were, whatever the rolled canvases in the 100 tubes turned out to be, they were real. The dust on them was real. The inventory card with its 1981 numbers was real. The sealed rooms and the reinforced door and the gallery hung floor to ceiling with paintings in gilt frames, all of that was real. She had been living in a world where $340 felt like the boundary of what was possible, where 43 job applications and 32 silences felt like evidence of a fixed limit, a ceiling she kept brushing her head against no matter how hard she pushed. She had not yet allowed herself to think past it. She was still being practical, still being reasonable, still keeping Carol's voice in her head as a counterweight against the thing she was not yet letting herself feel. But standing at the cleared window looking at the ghost of the garden, she let it in for one moment. Just one. The thought that the basement of this house, sealed and waiting for 37 years, might be the other side of every door that had been closed in her face, might be the answer to a question she had not known she was asking, might be what her great-uncle had left for the last name on the list, which was her name, which was always going to be her name, because she was the one who came here and signed the deed and found the key that fit and pushed the door open. She looked at the ghost of the garden and let herself feel it for one moment. Then she let it go and went back to work, because there were still 2 days until Dr. Wynne arrived, and there was still dust on every floor and windows that hadn't seen sunlight in 37 years. And if someone was coming to see what this place could be, she wanted to show it properly. She wanted to show it as what it was. The home of a man who had understood the value of things and kept them safe. The inheritance of a woman who was beginning, slowly, to understand the same. The second day of cleaning, Carol called. Not to apologize exactly. Carol was not a person who apologized for being practical, because in her mind being practical was never wrong, only sometimes poorly timed. But she called and asked how the estate looked and listened to Nina's answers with less interruption than usual, which was its own kind of concession. "You really think there's something significant down there?" Carol said, at the end. "Yes. And you're bringing in an expert. Day after tomorrow." A pause. "Okay." Another pause. "Mom asked about you. She won't call you herself, but she wanted me to tell you she hopes Lily is eating properly." Nina looked at Lily, who was at that moment eating crackers and cheese at the kitchen work table, having declared a 20-minute break from sweeping. Lily is eating fine. Good. The sound of Carol exhaling slowly. Nina, I want to say something, and I need you not to read it as me backing down from my position, because I stand by being careful and I stand by the practical concerns I raised. I know you do. But, a pause. I also know that you have never done anything reckless in your life. You've been cautious and responsible, and you've worked hard, and none of it has gotten you very far. And I think maybe I've been treating this like it was one more bad decision in a pattern when actually it might just be different. Unfamiliar. New. She stopped. That's all I wanted to say. Nina sat with that for a moment. Thank you, Carol. Don't read too much into it. I won't. After she hung up, she stood at the kitchen window for a while and looked out at the back grounds, the wild hedge of rose brambles along the stone wall, the skeleton of what had once been a formal garden dying its annual death. She thought about the word unfamiliar. How easy it was to call an unfamiliar thing a bad thing, to treat the discomfort of the unknown as evidence against it. She had spent enough of her life being careful and practical. She had applied to 43 jobs and heard back from 11 of them, and those 11 had all said no thank you, and she had thanked them for their time and kept being practical. She picked up the mop and went back to work. The night before Dr. Wynne arrived, Nina read through the journal entries she'd found in the ground floor study. There were 11 months of entries in the slim leather book, beginning in February of 1986 and ending in December. She read them slowly and in order, trying to build a picture of a man she had never met from the shape of his thinking. He wrote with precision and without self-pity, which she respected. He noted acquisitions with the same tone he used to note weather and deliveries, the specific factual register of someone who had long since made peace with the scope of what he'd built and no longer felt the need to express wonder at it. He cataloged things because he believed in the importance of record. He maintained things because he understood that objects required care. He organized things because disorder made him uncomfortable. But as the year progressed in the entries, something shifted. The notes about deliveries and acquisitions grew shorter. The entries began to include observations that had no practical purpose, the kind of things a person wrote when they were processing rather than recording. In September, he had written, "I have always believed that things outlast people and that this is as it should be. The object does not mourn its maker. It simply continues." In October, after the reference to the significant new acquisition, "I am 62 years old, and the collection is as complete as I am likely to make it. If I had known at 30 what I have learned at 60, I might have done certain things differently. But then everything would be different, and I cannot know if different would be better." In November, "I had a visitor to the gate today. I did not answer. The truck sat at the end of the drive for 20 minutes and then left. I recognized the plates." In December, the entry she had already read once. "There are people asking questions I can't answer safely. I don't know yet what I will need to do." That was the last entry. She closed the journal and put it back in her bag. Whoever had come to the gate with a truck he recognized by its plates, whatever questions they had been asking, she didn't know enough to understand the specifics. But the sequence was clear enough. By December of 1986, Edward Hartwell had understood that the life he had built in this house was no longer safe to live. And in February of 1987, he had driven past the gas station for the last time. He had not destroyed the collection. He had not arranged for it to be moved or sold or transferred. He had locked it in the basement of a house that would pass down through his family line eventually, and left. Nina thought about that choice for a long time, sitting in the motel room. In the dark, he had trusted the house. He had trusted the land. He had trusted the legal structure of inheritance to carry the collection forward to whoever came next, whoever turned out to be the right person to find it. She did not know yet whether she was the right person. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, didn't know enough about what was down there to understand what it required of her. But she had come here when she had nothing else. She had signed the deed and opened the door and gone down the stairs and looked at what was there without turning away. Maybe that was enough to start with. Patricia Wynne arrived on a Tuesday morning in a dark blue sedan that moved down the rutted, unpaved road toward the estate with the cautious deliberateness of a car driven by someone who was paying attention. She parked behind the Civic and got out and stood for a moment looking at the house the same way Nina had stood looking at it that first afternoon, that held breath before the scale of it settled. She was smaller than Nina had imagined, compact and precise in her movements. With short dark hair and wire-framed glasses, and the no-wasted motion manner of someone who organized large amounts of information for a living. She wore practical clothes, a waxed jacket and heavy boots, and she carried a leather bag and a hard case with equipment Nina didn't recognize. She shook Nina's hand. She looked at Lily with a brief professional smile. She looked back at the house. "How long has it been standing?" she asked. 1891, according to the county records. "And empty since when?" 1987, as far as anyone knows. Dr. Wen looked at the windows, at the stonework above the main entrance, at the iron on the windows. She looked at it the way Nina had learned to look at things over the past 4 days, with the attention of someone searching for information rather than just taking a picture. "You said in your email you hadn't disturbed the collection," she said. "I opened some of the rooms. I photographed what I could see. I didn't touch or move anything except a tube of canvas I opened and then immediately re-rolled." "Good." She picked up her hard case. "Shall we?" They went through the house in order, Nina leading with the heavy flashlight. Dr. Wen behind her with a flashlight of her own and a small device. She pointed at paintings and objects occasionally, without explaining what it was measuring. She was quiet for most of the ground floor tour, moving through the rooms with the same efficiency, noting things without commenting on them. At the study, she stopped at the shelves and looked at the ceramic pieces for a long time. She picked up one of them and turned it over and looked at the mark on the base and set it back. She picked up the pocket watch in the wooden box and opened it and looked at the movement inside and closed it again. She said nothing. They went upstairs to the locked room, the collector's room with the organized shelves. Dr. Wen stood in the center of it and moved her flashlight beam across the contents with the slow deliberateness of someone reading. She reached for one of the glass cases and looked at the coins inside it. She crouched to see the lower shelves. She spent a full 5 minutes in the room without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, "How did he acquire these?" "I don't know yet. He traveled extensively. Europe, South America. When? Post-war years, from what I've been able to find. Through the 60s and into the 70s. Dr. Wen straightened up and looked at Nina. Her expression was careful in the specific way that academic expressions were careful when they were containing something large. "I'd like to see the basement now," she said. They went down the stairs. Nina with the heavy flashlight, Dr. Wen with her own, Lily close behind with the small one. The smell of the corridor came up to meet them, cool and sealed and old. Dr. Wen moved down the corridor without speaking, stopping at each door, opening each room Nina had opened. In the tube room, she stood still for 30 seconds and then reached for one of the tubes and removed it from its slot and read the paper tag. She did not open it. In the gold room, she stood in the doorway for a full minute without moving. Nina watched her, watched the expression that was not quite under control anymore, the careful academic composure that was managing itself against something it had not expected to see. "These are the tube numbers from the inventory card," Dr. Wen said finally, still in the doorway of the gold room. "Yes, I found it taped inside the circuit panel." "May I see it?" Nina handed it over. Dr. Wen held it up to her flashlight and read it. She read it twice. She folded it along the original creases and handed it back without speaking. They went to the gallery. When Nina opened the large door and the light from both flashlights moved across the hanging paintings on all 4 walls, Dr. Wen made a sound that was not a word. Not loud. Just a breath that came out differently than the one that went in. She stepped into the gallery and stood in the center of it and turned slowly in a full circle, the flashlight beam moving across the frames, the surfaces, the signatures. She stopped at a painting on the far wall. Large, maybe 5 feet wide, a landscape with figures, the sky the layered gray gold of a late afternoon in a northern country. She moved close to it and shone her light directly on the lower right corner where a signature was painted in the same oil as the rest of the canvas. She stood there for a long time. Nina watched her and did not speak. When Dr. Wen finally stepped back from the painting, her face had changed. The careful composure was still there, but something behind it had shifted, the particular shift of a person who has found what they were looking for and found it larger than they expected. "Miss Calloway," she said. Her voice was level but not entirely steady. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to understand that I'm asking it as a professional who needs to understand the full picture of what I'm looking at." "Okay. Do you have any idea what your great-uncle's collection might be worth?" Nina thought about the inventory card in her pocket, about the 1981 numbers in the 4th column, About the art market reports she'd read on her phone in the motel parking lot. The auction results for paintings from this period in this provenance. I have some idea, she said carefully. Dr. Wen looked at her. Then she looked back at the painting on the far wall, the large landscape with the gray-gold sky and the signature in the lower right corner. The figure you might be thinking of, she said, is probably not large enough. The silence that followed was the kind that occupied a room completely, the kind that came after a statement that changed the dimensions of everything around it. Nina stood in the gallery of the Hartwell Estate basement, 40 feet below a house that had been sealed for 37 years, with a university art historian standing beside her looking at a painting that had not seen light since 1987, and she felt the number she had been carrying in her mind, the number she had been cautiously assembling from fragments of data and careful arithmetic, shift upward in a way she could not yet calculate. The paintings on the walls were still. The dust on the floor was still. The sealed rooms down the corridor held their contents in the dark. And somewhere in the county above them, the iron gates of the estate stood slightly open, the way they had stood since the day Edward Hartwell drove past the gas station and kept going, as though he had always known that someone would come through them eventually. Someone with his name on a deed. Someone who had nowhere else to go and nothing to lose by opening a locked door and walking down into the dark. Someone who was beginning to understand, standing in a basement gallery in the cold and the stillness, that what she was looking at was not just a collection. It was a life's work. It was 40 years of careful accumulation and private keeping. It was something that had waited with the specific patience of things meant to be found, in a house that had stood for over a century, on 40 acres of land that now had her name on it. And Dr. Patricia, when was telling her that the number she had been afraid to let herself believe might be real, was not large enough. Nina pressed her hand flat against the cold stone wall of the gallery and breathed. Outside, beyond the stone and the soil and the sealed rooms, beyond the bare trees and the iron gates and the unpaved road, the world was entirely unaware of what was in this basement. Her mother was making coffee in Millfield. Carol was answering emails in her sensible suburban house. The bank that held her maxed credit card was processing transactions. The 43 companies that had not replied to her applications were going about their days. None of them knew. Not yet. But that was about to change. And when it did, the change would be the kind that didn't reverse itself, that moved in only one direction, that altered the arithmetic of a life so fundamentally that before and after became the only way to measure time. Nina took her hand off the wall, straightened up, turned to face the gallery. "Tell me what you see," she said to Dr. Wen. "All of it. From the beginning." Dr. Wen turned from the large painting on the far wall and faced Nina with the expression of someone who had organized a great deal of information very quickly and was now deciding the best order to deliver it. "What I can tell you tonight, with only flashlights and without full analysis, is preliminary," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Nothing I say now replaces a proper assessment with proper equipment and lab verification. What I can give you right now is my trained eye and 30 years of looking at paintings." "Understood." The painting on the far wall. She turned back to it. The large landscape, the gray-gold sky, the figures small against the land. The signature in the lower right is consistent in style and period with work attributed to a 17th century Flemish painter whose authenticated pieces appear in 3 major European museum collections. If this is what the signature indicates, and the surface characteristics are consistent with that attribution, it is a work that has not appeared in any public record, sale, or exhibition that I am aware of. It would be considered a major undocumented work. She paused. The last comparable piece by this painter sold at a London auction house 9 years ago for $41 million. The number sat in the gallery air like something with physical weight. "That's one painting," Nina said. "That is one painting." Dr. Wen moved her flashlight to the adjacent wall. "These 3, here, are from a different hand, an earlier period, Italian, late 15th or early 16th century from the surface characteristics and the style of ground preparation. If my initial reading is correct, we are looking at panel paintings, not canvas, the kind of work that belongs in the collections of the Uffizi or the Prado. Panel paintings of this period and quality in private hands are exceptionally rare. I cannot tell you their value tonight. What I can tell you is that they should not exist outside an institutional collection, and yet here they are." She moved to the tubes room, and looked at the racks without entering. 112 tubes, she said. If even a portion of them contain works of comparable quality to what's on those walls, the number we are discussing is. She paused, chose her words carefully. Significant in a way that I don't have language for right now that would be responsible and accurate simultaneously. She turned back to Nina. There are also questions, she said, about provenance, about the acquisition histories, about where these works came from and under what circumstances they changed hands. Those questions matter legally, and they matter ethically, and they will need answers before any of this can be properly assessed or transferred. She looked at Nina steadily. But none of those questions change the fact of what is in this room. What is in these rooms? Your great-uncle built something extraordinary and sealed it in the ground, and you are the person who opened it. She paused again. What you do with that matters. It matters more than the number. Nina looked at her, looked at the paintings on the walls, looked at Lily, standing in the doorway with her small flashlight, watching both of them with the steady attention of a child who was storing everything carefully away for later. She thought of the motel parking lot, the $340, the folding cot at her mother's house, the 43 applications, and the 32 silences. She thought of Edward Hartwell driving past the gas station in February of 1987 with no way of knowing who would eventually sign the deed. No way of knowing it would be a woman named Nina Calloway with a daughter named Lily who ate crackers and swept floors and asked practical questions and held her rabbit when the work got serious. She looked at the paintings one more time. Then let's start at the beginning, she said. All of it. Dr. Wynne worked through the night. Nina had not expected that. She had assumed the evening would end with a preliminary conversation and a plan for the following day, the kind of organized professional handoff that implied tomorrow and schedules and normal hours. But Dr. Wynne did not seem to operate that way. Once she began, she continued, moving through the gallery and the side rooms with a systematic attention that had its own momentum. The kind that came from 30 years of looking at things and understanding that the work did not pause simply because the light outside changed. Nina sent Lily upstairs to the drawing room, where she had made a temporary sleeping arrangement on the uncovered sofa with their coats and the emergency blanket from the car. Lily went without argument, which meant she was exhausted, taking the rabbit and one of the flashlights and asking Nina only to leave the kitchen door open so the light from below would reach the ground floor. Nina told her she would. Then she went back down the stairs with the large flashlight and 2 cups of coffee from the thermos she'd packed that morning, and she sat on a folding camp stool she had thought to bring, and she watched Dr. Wynne work. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The process was slow and exact. Dr. Wynne moved through the gallery painting by painting, spending between 5 and 20 minutes on each one, using a small portable UV lamp she had in her equipment case that revealed details invisible under normal light. The underpainting, the repairs, the areas where earlier restorers had worked and where the original paint ended. She made notes in a small notebook with the concentrated shorthand of someone who had developed a personal system over decades. She photographed each piece with a professional camera, multiple exposures, multiple angles, macro shots of signatures and corners and areas of particular interest. She did not narrate as she worked. That was the thing Nina found strangest and most reassuring about her. She did not perform the process, did not offer running commentary designed to manage Nina's expectations or demonstrate her expertise. She simply worked, and the silence of her working was more informative than any amount of talking would have been. Around midnight, Dr. Wynne sat down on the folding stool Nina had vacated and poured herself the rest of the thermos and drank it, and then opened her notebook and looked at what she had written. 18 paintings in this room, she said. I need laboratory analysis and archive research to give you definitive attributions. There are 2 I am reasonably uncertain about. They may be high-quality period copies rather than originals, though the surface characteristics argue against that. The remaining 16 I have formed a working view on, and I want to share it with you with the understanding that a working view is not a final assessment. Understood. She read from the notebook. Not all the notes, just the attributions, the names she was assigning to each painting as a working hypothesis. Nina listened and wrote them down in her own notebook, the names she would search later, the names that would anchor her in something specific after days of guessing at scale. When she finished reading the list, She closed her notebook and looked at Nina. "If these attributions hold," she said, "and I believe the majority of them will, the paintings in this gallery alone represent a collection of a scale and quality that has not appeared on the private market in the past 30 years. Individual pieces on this list would be significant discoveries for any major auction house. Together, they represent something museums and collectors would consider extraordinary." Nina looked at the list in her own notebook. 16 names. Some she recognized from the community college art history textbook she hadn't thought about in 15 years. Some she did not know at all. "And the tubes," she said. Dr. Wen exhaled slowly. "I need to open them properly, with the right tools and the right environment. Rolling and unrolling old canvas incorrectly causes damage. I can't do it tonight." But based on the tagging system and the inventory card, the tubes represent a second collection, distinct from the gallery pieces, possibly acquisitions from a different period or a different source. "I don't know yet what they contain." "And the gold room?" A pause. "That is a different matter. Pre-Columbian gold objects of that type and apparent age are regulated by a body of international law that did not exist when they were acquired. The legal framework around their ownership and transfer is complicated and in some cases actively contested. Some may be claimable by their country of origin. I am not a lawyer, and I can't tell you what your rights are with respect to those objects." She looked at Nina steadily. "What I can tell you is that they are extraordinary, and that they require careful handling, both physically and legally." Nina wrote that down too. She and Dr. Wen left the basement at 2 in the morning, and Nina locked the kitchen door behind them with the key on the iron ring and checked the lock twice. They drove back to Greaves in their separate cars, Lily asleep across the back seat of the Civic, the rabbit tucked under her arm. The call started 3 days later. Dr. Wen had been efficient. She had returned to the university and made inquiries with the particular care of an academic who understood that the wrong word in the wrong ear could set things moving in directions that were hard to redirect. She had reached out to 2 colleagues, a conservation specialist from a museum in Philadelphia and an authentication expert she had worked with before on a provenance case. She had asked them to come quietly, on a preliminary basis, which was academic language for please don't tell anyone yet. They came on a Thursday, both of them, driving separately. The conservation specialist was a tall woman named Grace who carried equipment cases with the practiced ease of someone who moved fragile things for a living. The authentication expert was a compact man in his 50s named Thomas who spoke sparingly and looked at surfaces for very long periods of time without saying anything, which Nina was beginning to understand was a quality shared by people who spent their careers reading objects rather than people. They worked through the basement over 2 full days, in pairs, with the generator Nina had finally rented running extension cords to portable lights that changed the quality of the basement completely, the rooms visible now in warm, even brightness rather than the partial truths of flashlights. Nina watched a great deal and asked careful questions and wrote down the answers. Lily had taken to sitting at the kitchen work table upstairs with books from the library, reading in the thin winter light from the cleaned windows, coming down occasionally to bring everyone crackers and to ask questions of her own that the experts answered with the particular seriousness they reserved for people who asked things plainly and waited for real answers. On the second day, Thomas opened the first 30 tubes. He did it with Grace beside him and both of them in cotton gloves, using a humidifier to slightly raise the moisture in the air of the tube room before beginning, working slowly and without rushing, unrolling each canvas just enough to assess it, and then rolling it carefully back and recapping the tube. He read each tag number aloud and Grace recorded them, and Dr. Wen cross-referenced them against the inventory card. Nina sat on the camp stool in the doorway and watched. The tubes, as they were opened one by one, contained drawings and smaller paintings, some on paper and some on canvas, some of them studies and preparatory sketches, some of them finished works on a smaller scale than the gallery paintings. The names Thomas read aloud when he identified them were sometimes the same names from the gallery list and sometimes new ones. Studies by artists whose finished works hung in the Louvre. Preparatory drawings for paintings Nina had seen reproduced in textbooks. Small finished pieces that Thomas described as cabinet paintings, the kind of intimate work that wealthy collectors had commissioned in the 17th century for private rooms, meant to be held and examined up close rather than hung at a distance. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They did not open all of them that day. They stopped at 30 and returned to the university to begin the archive research, the provenance tracing, the process of locating each work in the historical record or establishing why it was absent from it. That process, Dr. Wen explained to Nina, would take weeks. It involved comparing her photographs against records held by auction houses, museums, the Art Loss Register, national heritage databases, and the records of families who had documented their collections before the Second World War and then tried to account for what had happened to them afterward. It was the provenance work that Nina had been both expecting and dreading. Dr. Wen called her 1 week into the archive research. She called in the evening, after Lily was asleep, and Nina took the phone out to the stone steps of the front entrance and sat in the cold and listened. Some of what we have is straightforward, Dr. Wen said. Works that appear in Edward Hartwell's own purchase records, bought through legitimate dealers in the 1950s and 1960s in an open market where provenance was not as well documented as it is today, but where there is no indication of wrongful acquisition. Those are yours, legally and morally yours. And the rest? A long pause. We've found 7 works so far that appear on lists held by European families documenting collections that were displaced during the Nazi occupation. Families who were forced to sell at below-market prices under duress, or whose collections were confiscated. In the post-war period, many of these works circulated through dealers in Europe and the United States and ended up in private hands through sales that were technically legal at the time, but are now understood to be the result of historic injustice. Nina let the cold settle around her. The stone step was very hard beneath her. Those 7 works, she said. Are they in the gallery? 4 are in the gallery. 3 are in the tubes. What happens to them? Another pause. That is ultimately your decision, and a legal process will be involved regardless. The families, or their descendants, have legal claims that courts in multiple countries have historically recognized. You could contest those claims, and many people in your position have done so, sometimes successfully. Or you could choose not to contest them and work with the families and the relevant institutions to arrange restitution. Restitution, meaning I give them back. Yes. Nina looked out at the dark grounds, the dead garden, the outline of the stone basin in the dark, and the remaining pieces, the ones that aren't disputed. That's the larger portion of the collection. 11 gallery paintings with clear provenance. 92 of the 112 tube works assessed, so far with no identified claims. The gold objects, which are a separate legal category but equally resolvable in most cases. And several pieces that require more research before we can determine their status. Dr. Wen paused again. I want you to understand something, Nina. The restitution pieces, the 7 works we've identified, they are not the collection. They are 7 works out of what appears to be considerably more than 100. The rest of the collection is yours. What the rest of the collection is worth, even at this early stage of assessment, is a number that should be given to you by someone with more authority than I have right now. But I can tell you that it is not a small number. How not small? Dr. Wen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone uncertain. The quiet of someone choosing precision. The partial assessment to date, covering the gallery paintings with clear provenance and the tube works examined so far, suggests a collection value in excess of $300 million at current market rates. That figure will almost certainly increase as the remaining tubes are assessed. The gold objects will require specialist appraisal, but initial estimates from Thomas place their value in the range of 40 to 80 million. We are not finished, but what we have assessed so far puts the total above 400 million. The stone step, the cold, the dark beyond the iron gates. Nina said nothing for a long time. Nina, Dr. Wen said, I'm here. Are you all right? She thought about the motel room in Greaves, the folding cot and the thin walls, the crackers and the peanut butter and the vending machine that kept the dollar, the $340 that had felt like the edge of a cliff. She thought about Lily saying seriously this is serious work and wearing rubber boots into a basement and asking the experts questions they answered plainly and holding her rabbit and being 8 years old and entirely unafraid. I'm all right, Nina said. I need some time to think. Of course. Take what you need. Call me when you're ready. She sat on the stone step for a long time after the call ended, the phone in her lap, the cold working through her coat. The estate grounds were very quiet. The bare trees stood still without wind. Somewhere a long way off, a car moved along the county road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the sky above the tree line and then gone. For $100 million. Not as a fantasy, not as an imagined possibility she'd been carefully not allowing herself to believe in. As a preliminary figure, a partial assessment, a number that would increase as the work continued. In a basement below the house that had her name on the deed, she thought about the 7 pieces that needed to go back to the families they had come from. She did not think about it the way Carol would have thought about it, as a subtraction from the total, as a loss. She thought about it as the right thing, the thing Edward Hartwell should have resolved before he died and did not, and that she was in a position to resolve instead. It was not a hard decision. It was perhaps the easiest decision she would make in the entire process, because it was the one where the correct choice was also the obvious choice, and she was grateful for those. She went back inside and up the stairs and looked at Lily sleeping in the drawing room, the rabbit on the pillow beside her, and she stood in the doorway for a minute in the dark, watching her daughter breathe. Then she went to the kitchen and made the call she had been putting off making. Carol answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting for it. The preliminary estimate is over $400 million, Nina said, without preamble. Silence. A very complete silence. Carol, I heard you. A sound that might have been Carol sitting down, the creak of a chair. $400 million. Preliminary. The assessment isn't finished. $400 million. In a basement. In a basement. Another silence. Then, very quietly, Nina, I'm sorry. For what specifically? For making you feel like this was another bad decision. For treating unfamiliar as the same thing as wrong. A pause. I was scared for you. You have Lily and you had nothing, and I was scared. But I said it in ways that were not kind, and I'm sorry for that. Nina thought about the phone call from the motel parking lot. Carol's patient, measured voice explaining all the ways this could fail. The $60,000 Tennessee sinkhole story. The gentle insistence that practical was always better than hopeful. You were trying to protect me, Nina said. I know that. Protecting you and believing in you are not the same thing, and I should have managed both. A breath. What are you going to do? I need to talk to lawyers. About the estate, about the collection, about what the process looks like for something like this. And there are 7 pieces that need to go back to families they were taken from. That's the first thing. You're giving them back. Yes. Without a fight. Carol, they were taken from people who were being persecuted. There's nothing to fight about. A long pause. Okay. And she said it differently than she'd said it before, not with the brisk efficiency of someone filing information away, but with something underneath it that sounded like genuine awe. Okay. Nina called her mother the next morning. She had thought about how to say it and decided that there was no way to say it that would not require Diane to sit down and then sit quietly for a while. So she said it directly and waited. Diane said nothing for so long that Nina checked the phone screen to see if the call had dropped. Mama, Nina said. I'm here. The particular tone of Diane's voice when she was processing something large, a tone Nina had not heard since her father died, the voice under the voice. I didn't know, Diane said. About that side of the family. About any of it. Neither did I. You always were the one who went toward things instead of away from them. She said it quietly, and it did not sound like criticism, which was the thing that surprised Nina most. It sounded like Diane was saying it to herself. Like she was putting a name on something she had always known, but never formed into words. I'll come and see you soon, Nina said. Both of us. Lily wants to show you the garden. That girl, Diane said, and the warmth in it was so unexpected and so real that Nina had to press her eyes shut for a moment. Okay, come when you're ready. The news broke on a cold morning in late January, for weeks after Dr. Wynn's first visit to the estate. Nina had known it was coming. Dr. Wynn had warned her that archive research of this scope involved multiple institutions and multiple people, and that some of those people talked. She had hired a lawyer by then, a woman named Sarah Osei, who specialized in art law and estate matters, and who had driven out from the city with 2 colleagues and spent 2 days at the estate reviewing documents and asking detailed questions, and then given Nina a comprehensive explanation of where she stood, legally, which was in a complicated but ultimately strong position. It was a local newspaper first. A short piece, not front page, picked up from county records, the kind of story that regional reporters found when they were going through property transactions and noticed something unusual. Estate transfer in Whitmore County. Abandoned property. New owner. Then someone connected it to the university inquiries, to the names of the experts who had visited, to the rumors that had moved through the conservation and art history community with the speed that specialized rumors always traveled. Within 3 days, the local piece had been picked up by a state paper. Within a week, it was national. Nina did not read most of it. She read enough to understand what was being said and to confirm that the information being reported was incomplete, which was expected, and that the tone was the one she had anticipated, which was the treasure story tone, the discovery narrative, the lucky woman and the hidden fortune, and the phrases that made it sound like something that had happened to her rather than something she had gone toward. She gave no interviews. Her lawyer had advised against it while the legal and authentication work was in progress, and Nina agreed, not because she wanted to manage her image, but because she genuinely had nothing to say yet that was fully true. She knew the shape of what she had. She did not yet know all of what it meant. But the people in her life heard about it, and that was its own kind of revelation. Her former landlord called to say he hoped there were no hard feelings about the eviction, which was such a specific kind of audacity that Nina sat with the phone at her ear for 3 seconds processing it before she said, simply, that she hoped he had a good day, and ended the call. The insurance company that had closed the regional office and ended her job sent a form letter about consulting opportunities that Nina did not open. 3 of the 12 companies that had not replied to her job application sent emails. She did not reply to any of them. The motel man in Greaves called her cell number, which he'd taken when she first checked in. He said he heard the news and wanted her to know he was glad it worked out, and that his uncle had always said old Hartwell kept the most extraordinary things, and that he supposed the old man had been right. He did not ask for anything. He just said he was glad. Nina thanked him and meant it. The thing she had not anticipated was her neighbor from the old apartment building, Mrs. Patel, who sent a card in the mail, a plain card with a pressed flower inside, and a note in her careful handwriting that said only, "Land stays." I knew. It arrived on the same day as the first of the national news pieces, and Nina kept it on the kitchen work table of the Hartwell Estate kitchen and looked at it often. 6 weeks after Dr. Wynn's first visit, the authentication work reached a point where a formal appraisal could begin. Nina's lawyer had arranged for a specialist firm, the kind that worked on estate and insurance appraisals for major collections. 2 senior appraisers who arrived with their own equipment and their own methodology and who spent 8 days in the basement of the estate working through every item in sequence. On the morning of the 9th day, they gave Nina their preliminary findings in the drawing room. Seated at the table Nina had cleared and cleaned in the first week, the windows clean now and the light coming through clearly. The estate had utilities again, electricity and heat and running water, the rooms properly lit for the first time in 37 years. The chandelier in the entry hall had been cleaned and relit, and it cast warm fractured light across the marble floor below and up the curved staircase with its layer of clean wood visible now beneath the dust. The senior appraiser, a gray-haired man named Robert Hale who spoke with the measured economy of someone who had delivered large numbers before and knew the impact of rushing them, laid 3 folders on the table. The collection, as we have assessed it, he said, represents 4 primary categories. The gallery paintings, comprising 22 original works in the main basement gallery. The rolled works in storage, 112 tubes, assessed in full over the past week. The pre-Columbian gold objects, 41 individual pieces. And a 4th category I want to address separately, which is the secondary collection from the upstairs room, the ceramic pieces, coins, pocket watches, and smaller objects, which we have assessed as an aggregate. He opened the first folder and placed it on the table facing Nina. Gallery paintings, he said. Total appraised value at current market rates, absent any work subject to restitution proceedings. $218 million. Nina looked at the number on the paper, did not speak. He opened the second folder. Rolled works in storage. Of the 112 tubes, 94 contain works we have appraised. The remaining 18 require further conservation assessment before valuation is possible. Of the 94 appraised, the total value at current market rates is $112 million. He opened the third folder. Pre-Columbian gold objects. 41 pieces. 8 of these are subject to potential origin claims by institutions in Peru and Colombia, which will need to be assessed through legal channels. The 33 pieces not subject to identified claims are appraised at a combined value of $64 million. He folded his hands on the table. The secondary collection from the upstairs room, assessed as an aggregate of ceramics, coins, watches, and smaller objects, is valued at a combined $16 million. He looked at Nina. Total appraised value of the Hartwell collection, excluding pieces subject to restitution or legal review, is $410 million. The room was very quiet. The light came through the cleaned windows in long pale lines across the floor. The chandelier in the entry hall was just visible through the open door, its crystals catching the cold winter light. Nina sat at the table and looked at the 3 folders and the number on the top page of the first folder and did not say anything for a long time. $410 million. The Hartwell collection. Her great-uncle's name. Her name on the deed. Her daughter's rubber boots on the basement stairs. She thought about the eviction notice on the kitchen table in the old apartment, the red ink date circled on the calendar. She thought about the folded letter from the law office, forwarded 3 times, each crossing out a different place she had lived and then left. She thought about sitting in the car outside her mother's house the night before she drove to Greaves, the $340 and the 12-year-old Civic, and the question she could not stop carrying. The question of whether the ceiling she kept brushing against was real or whether it was something else, something that could be pushed through if she could find the right place to push. She had not found the right place. She had driven to Greaves on no money and signed a deed for a house full of 37 years of sealed silence. She had bought a camera on clearance at the hardware store and gone down a stone staircase with her daughter and a flashlight and looked at what was there. That was all she had done. Looked at what was there, told the truth about what she saw, made the choice that was obvious when she was given one. Robert Hale was still looking at her, patient in the way of people who delivered large numbers and understood that the receiving took time. There will be legal steps, Nina said finally. The restitution pieces. The process of sale or transfer. Yes, that process is involved and will take time. A collection of this scale does not move quickly through proper channels. You are looking at years, not months, before full resolution. That's all right. She looked at the folders. What happens first? First, you instruct your legal team on how you wish to proceed with the restitution items. That process will shape the public narrative around the collection's management and will matter for how institutions and auction houses engage with the rest. I've already told my lawyer. All 7 paintings go back to the families. Unconditionally, without legal contest. He nodded. He did not look surprised. That will be noted in our report. It will affect how the collection is discussed publicly and professionally. Positively. I'm not doing it for how it's discussed. I understand that. He collected the folders and stood. You should be aware that collections of this type, when handled with the transparency and integrity you appear to be committed to, often generate significant institutional interest. Museums, foundations, cultural bodies. The conversation around what you choose to do with this collection will be one of the more significant ones in the art world in recent years. He paused. What remains of it, after the restitution pieces are handled, is still worth $410 million. That is not a small responsibility. No, Nina said. It isn't. After he left, she sat alone at the drawing room table for a while. The estate had changed around her in the past weeks. The utilities restored. The floors cleaned. The windows clear. The main staircase swept and tested and declared sound by the structural engineer she'd hired. The library dusted. The books readable again in their proper order. The dining room table finally cleared, the china washed and stored. The kitchen functional for the first time in decades, the range replaced with a modern one, the copper pots cleaned of their oxidation and hanging from the ceiling rack again. It was not a home yet, not entirely. It was a house that was remembering how to be lived in, the way something woke slowly from a long stillness. But the proportions of it, the quality of the stonework and the height of the ceilings and the way the light moved through the cleaned windows across the floors, all of it had been there waiting under the dust and the sealed silence for 37 years. It did not need to be created. It only needed to be allowed. She thought about where to live while the legal process worked through its stages. She thought about the 12 bedrooms and the 40 acres and the stone cottage at the far end of the property that the lawyer had mentioned in his initial description, the groundskeeper's residence, which Nina had not yet seen. She thought about Lily's school and whether Greaves had one, and whether a town that size had what an 8-year-old needed, and how far it was from the city where options were wider. She thought about Carol, who had apologized with more honesty than Nina had expected, who had said protecting you and believing in you are not the same thing. She thought about calling her to come out and see the estate, not to prove something, but simply because Carol was her sister and would want to see it, and the conversation would be easier face to face, in a house with working lights and heat, with the drawing room windows cleared and the garden visible beyond. She thought about her mother saying come when you're ready and meaning it in the quiet way Diane meant the things she didn't know how to say plainly. She thought about Lily, who was at school in Greaves that morning, at the small elementary school where Nina had enrolled her 2 weeks earlier after it became clear they would be staying through the winter at minimum. Lily had made 2 friends already, had been asked to bring in something interesting for show and tell, and had spent an entire evening debating whether to bring one of the coins from the secondary collection before deciding that was too much, that instead she would bring a photograph of the chandelier in the entry hall, because that was interesting enough without being overwhelming. That was Lily's phrase. Interesting enough without being overwhelming. Nina had written it in her notebook. On the day the first restitution was completed, Nina stood in a lawyer's office in the city with the Mendel family, 3 generations of them, the granddaughter and her 2 adult children, and 1 teenager who was the same age the original owner had been when the painting was taken from his family in 1942. The granddaughter, a woman in her 70s named Ruth, held the authentication photographs and the provenance documentation and looked at them for a long time before looking at Nina. We stopped expecting to see it, Ruth said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. My father talked about it his whole life. Where it had hung. What the light did to it in the afternoon. He died not knowing. I'm sorry, Nina said. I'm sorry it took this long. You didn't take it. You returned it. Ruth looked at her with an expression that Nina found difficult to hold. Too direct, too full. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing. The painting would be transferred from the estate to a museum that Ruth's family had arranged to receive it, where it would be displayed with the full history of its displacement and recovery documented in the label. There would be 5 more transfers like this one in the coming months, each involving families whose grandparents and great-grandparents had documented their collections before the war and spent the decades after trying to account for what had been lost. Some of those families had given up. Some had not. All of them would now receive what Nina's lawyer had helped arrange. The financial cost of the restitutions was something Nina had not calculated and did not calculate. The 7 works were not hers to keep. The $410 million figure did not need to include them. In the months that followed, the legal process moved with the careful deliberateness that large things moved with. The collection was formally cataloged and documented. Select pieces were loaned to an exhibition organized by one of the institutions that had been involved in the appraisal, the first time many of the works had been seen publicly. The exhibition was reviewed in papers Nina did not follow and discussed by people in circles she was not part of, and the reviews and the discussions were consistently the same in one respect, that the Hartwell collection was among the most significant private collections to emerge in decades, and that its management by the heir was notable for the transparency and ethical commitment with which the restitution process had been handled. Nina read those pieces briefly and then put her phone down and went to see how the work on the stone cottage was progressing. She had decided to live there. The main house was too large for 2 people and too significant to treat as simply a home, though it would be that too in some portion. The stone cottage at the far end of the property had 3 bedrooms and a working fireplace and a small garden of its own, and the contractor who was doing the renovation had told her it had better bones than a house 3 times its age. Nina liked that. Better bones. Lily liked the idea of walking across the estate grounds every day and back again, of the main house being a place they went rather than simply lived in, a distinction that appealed to her sense of the appropriate. She had strong feelings about the appropriate. She had decided that the library should be a real library, available to people in the county who wanted to use it, which was the kind of idea that an 8-year-old could have without knowing it was both generous and logistically complex. Nina had taken notes on it. She was good at taking notes on things Lily said and sitting with them until the practical shape of them emerged. The thing that Carol said to her, months later, on a warm afternoon in early spring when Carol and her family drove out to see the estate for the first time, was the thing Nina carried with her longest. They were standing in the garden, which was being restored by a landscape firm that specialized in historical gardens and had been working from photographs taken in the 1920s when the estate was still occupied and the formal plantings were intact. The stone basin in the center had been cleared and restored and held water again. The rose arbor had been rebuilt along the west wall. The beds were edged and planted and beginning to show the first suggestions of what they would be by summer. Carol stood in the garden and looked at the house behind them, the 4 stories of gray stone, the towers, the complicated roofline against the spring sky, and then she looked at Nina. "I told myself I was being sensible," Carol said. "Every time I pushed back, every time I said be practical, be careful, think about this. I told myself I was protecting you." "You were," Nina said. "But I was also scared." She looked at the garden. "I think I was scared because I'd spent so long being sensible and practical and careful, and it had given me a solid, decent life. A good life. And I didn't want to believe that it might have also closed something off. That there were ways of going through the world I'd chosen not to try because they looked like risks." A pause. "You went toward this when you had nothing. When everything said go back. Wait, be careful. You went toward it anyway." "I didn't have a better option," Nina said. "Yes, you did." Carol turned to look at her. "You had my couch. You had Mom's spare room. You had safe and small and manageable. You chose this instead." She gestured at the house, the garden, the grounds. "That wasn't luck, Nina. That was you." Nina looked at the house. The windows clean, the light in them different now, warm and inhabited rather than dark and sealed. Lily visible through the drawing room window, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book, the rabbit beside her. She thought about the iron ring of keys in her coat pocket, the one she still carried even though the estate had a full set of modern locks now, properly keyed and professionally fitted. The 3 original keys on the old iron ring. The first one that opened the front door. The second that turned the circuit panel in the basement corridor. The third that opened the locked room upstairs. She had carried them since the day Robert Altman pressed them into her hand across the folding table in his office above the dry goods store. She did not carry them because they were practically necessary. She carried them because they were the first thing that had been given to her freely in a long time, with no conditions and no strings, just a man handing over a ring of keys and telling her the property was hers. She thought about Edward Hartwell at the desk in the ground floor study, writing in the slim journal with his small, neat handwriting, noting acquisitions and weather and the specific quality of light in the lower gallery, writing about things that outlast people, writing that he could not know at 30 what he had learned at 60, writing, at the end, that there were people asking questions he couldn't answer safely. He had built something he could not protect. He had done what he could, which was to seal it properly and leave it to the land and the deed and whoever came after him. What he could not have known was who came after him. A woman 34 years old with $340 and a daughter who wore rubber boots and asked practical questions and decided on her own when the work was serious. He could not have known, but the land knew. The land had held it all, the sealed rooms and the paintings in their tubes and the gold in the dark, held it with the specific patience of things that did not rush, that waited for the right moment and the right person and the right question asked in the right direction. Nina looked at Carol, who was still watching her with that expression, the one that contained the apology and the awe and the complicated love of a sister who had underestimated someone she knew well. "Come inside," Nina said. "I want to show you the library." They walked across the garden, the stone path solid beneath their feet, the new plantings green on either side, and through the side entrance into the house where Lily was already at the door waiting. Having heard them through the window, her book in one hand and the rabbit in the other, and the particular expression on her face of someone who has been waiting to show something to a person for a long time and is very ready. The chandelier in the entry hall caught the spring light and broke it into pieces across the marble floor. The house breathed around them, warm and lit and open, the way things breathed when they had stopped holding something in. And somewhere in the basement, in the rooms that had been photographed and documented and cataloged, and that were now in the careful process of being understood and restored and returned to the world in the ways they were meant to be, the collection that Edward Hartwell had spent his lifetime building waited quietly in the appropriate dark for the next thing that would be asked of it. Not locked away anymore. Not sealed. Just held carefully, as things worth keeping should always be held, by someone who understood their value and had no intention of looking away. Nina Calloway stood in the entry hall of the Hartwell Estate and watched the light move across the floor and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ceiling she had been pressing against had not been a ceiling at all. It had been a door. She had just needed to find the right key. She had not yet told Lily the number. Not because she was hiding it, but because she had been trying to work out how to say it to an 8-year-old in a way that was true without being destabilizing. She had watched parents in movies hand children enormous news and watched the children receive it with either confusion or hysteria, and neither felt right. She told her on a quiet Tuesday evening in the stone cottage, after the contractor had finished for the day and the place smelled of sawdust and fresh plaster, and the coal fire Nina had learned to light properly. Lily was eating soup at the small kitchen table, and the rabbit was on the bench beside her, and Nina sat across from her and said simply that the appraisers had finished their work and she knew now what the collection was worth. How much? Lily asked. $410 million. Lily held her spoon over her soup for a moment. Is that a lot? Yes, baby. That's a very lot. Lily put the spoon down. She looked at the rabbit. She looked at her mother. Are we rich now? We're going to be comfortable for a long time. We're going to be safe. But are we rich? Nina thought about how to answer that. Yes, she said, in ways we weren't before. Lily picked up her spoon again and ate a bite of soup. Then she said, I knew it was going to be a lot. When we went in the tube room and I counted the tubes, I thought, there are 112 things in here, and even if they were each only worth a little bit, that's still a lot. That's good arithmetic. I was trying to be realistic, Lily said, in the tone she used when she was being precise. I didn't want to think it was more than it was and then be disappointed. Nina looked at her daughter across the small table in the cottage kitchen, the firelight and the sawdust smell and the soup cooling in both their bowls, and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. Not pride exactly, not relief exactly, but some specific compound of both that belonged only to parents watching their children be themselves in the particular way that was entirely their own. We're going to be fine, Nina said. I know, Lily said. We were going to be fine anyway. Which was, Nina thought, the truest thing either of them had said in a long time. The first major sale from the collection happened the following autumn, when 3 of the gallery paintings were offered at a London auction house in a sale that had been announced 3 months in advance and generated the kind of attention that involved phones that did not stop ringing and journalists who found Nina's lawyer's number somehow and called it repeatedly. Nina did not attend the sale. She watched a live feed on her laptop at the kitchen table in the stone cottage with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. The 3 paintings sold in 45 minutes of bidding. The combined result was $87 million. Nina watched the numbers on the screen and felt something abstract, as if the numbers were happening to a different version of her life running parallel to this one. The version she could not quite connect to the woman sitting at a kitchen table in a stone cottage on 40 acres in Whitmore County with a contractor starting on the library restoration in the main house next door. Her lawyer called immediately after the gavel fell. She answered and listened and said yes and thank you and yes. She hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then she called Diane. Her mother answered on the first ring. I watched, Diane said, before Nina could speak. Her voice was different from usual, stripped of its protective layers. I watched the whole thing online. That woman at the museum told me how to find the live feed last week when she called about the loan. You talked to the museum? They called the house about some loan documentation. I happened to answer. A pause. Nina, those paintings. I know. Your father's family. All those years. I never knew. Her voice caught slightly on the last word, the sound of someone who was genuinely moved and not accustomed to being moved and had not prepared a defense against it. I always thought that side of things was complicated, that there was something there that didn't add up, but I never imagined. Neither did I. A long quiet. Then Diane said, in the voice she used when she was being honest in the way that cost her something. I should have encouraged you more. When you were younger, when you were always the one who went toward things. I thought I was teaching you to be careful, but maybe I was teaching you to be afraid. Nina felt the weight of that. The specific weight of words from a parent that arrived decades after they would have mattered most, but mattered still. You did the best you knew how to do, Nina said. That's a kind answer. It's the true one. Another silence, shorter this time. Will you come for Christmas? Both of you. I'll sort out the room properly this time. Not the fold-out. Yeah, Nina said. We'll come. The library opened the following spring. It had taken the better part of a year to restore the room properly, the shelves cleaned and repaired, and the books assessed by a specialist who identified 17 of them as having genuine historical value, which they discussed and ultimately agreed should stay in the library rather than be sold, accessible to the public on the reading days that Nina had decided to offer 3 times a week. The rest of the library's collection was supplemented with purchases, the shelves fuller now than they had been even in Edward Hartwell's time. The books organized by subject in the system he had established, which Nina had kept because it was a good system, and because keeping it felt like a way of acknowledging the man who had built this room and this collection and trusted the land to carry it forward. The opening was small by design. Local families, a few people from the County Historical Society, the motel man from Greaves and his wife, Mrs. Patel, who had driven 3 hours because Nina had asked her, and she had said without hesitation that she would come. Robert Altman, the lawyer, who brought a bottle of wine and stood in the entry hall looking at the chandelier with the expression of a man seeing something he had imagined from the outside of a door for years. Lily gave a short speech. She had written it herself and practiced it twice and declined Nina's offer to review it in advance, on the grounds that she knew what she wanted to say. She stood at the front of the library with her hands at her sides and said that her great-great-uncle had collected things his whole life because he understood that things could carry knowledge and history and meaning across time, and that the best thing you could do with things like that was share them. She said that the library was open to anyone in the county who wanted to use it because knowledge that sat in a sealed room wasn't doing its job. She said she hoped people would come and read the books and look at the art and understand that this estate had been built to last and was still lasting and intended to keep lasting. She said thank you and sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and everyone else followed, and the sound of it filled the library and moved out into the entry hall and up the staircase. And Nina stood at the back of the room, watching her daughter receive it with the same calm she had always had, and thought about rubber boots and a stuffed rabbit and serious work. The sun was coming through the drawing room windows. The chandelier was throwing its broken light across the marble floor. The house was full of people who were supposed to be there. Nina Calloway stood in the back of the library and looked at all of it, her daughter and the room and the light, and felt that she had arrived at something. Not the end of anything. Not a conclusion. A place to stand from which the next thing could be done. She thought about the iron ring of keys in her coat pocket. She reached in and felt them, the cold weight of the 3 old keys, the rough texture of the iron. She had carried them so long they felt like a part of her. She let them go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.